sports psychology has been around, but it's relatively a newer-ish concept within psychology, a new topic of psychology, if you may. Sports psychology is, and I have all the different reasons why sports psychologists are used right here, and we'll go over each individual concept. But sports psychology is really about the individual. And again, you could research groups of people. We're going to talk about the social facilitation inhibition theory, which is kind of like the larger topic within the baseline in which psychology and sports psychology was created from. However, when we think about sports psychology today, it's a little bit different. Remember how when we talked about learning styles, we talked about how technology has evolved many concepts of psychology. It's the same concept here. Psychology has evolved to the point where what we see online through our tablets, through our phones, through our computers, through just online in general, has kind of shaped the way we analyze and process information. So the same concept goes for sports psychology. We talk about social media, how social media affects us. Right? Social media affects us in ways of a lot of our decisions that we make. Now, for more classical people, people over the age of 40, 50, more, I think it's more 65 and older, more or less, because if we think about the average gamer is is 35. So if we think about above the age of 60, 65, technology doesn't really affect those people as much. Sports psychology is a very big topic in psychology, just in general, just because sports psychology influence how we do things. And we're going to go over gamification. Gamification is changing the way we do work, the way we do boring things in life, chores. It's making games out of what we do. It's having incentive in our behaviors. So that is kind of how the future of sports psychology is heading. And sports psychology is becoming greater and bigger every day. And even considering esports with sports psychology. Let me tell you something. Every sports team, every major sports team has a sports psychologist. Actually, one of the first sports psychologists was recruited by the Chicago Cubs. And we'll talk a little bit about Griffith and what he does as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the concepts of sports psychology. So sports psychologists help you understand yourself as an athlete, your identity as an athlete, why you're there, what your purpose is, right? Mental strategies, learning, practice, and performance factors, yes, but it also has to do with you as a person, how you identify yourself, right? So when I think about myself as an athlete, or even when I was playing squadrons competitively, how do I want to make an impact? How do I not only want to make an impact on myself and my self-worth, but also on the people that watch me every day, which is also social facilitation theory, which we'll go over in a second. Sports psychology helps you work better with your parents. So understanding your role models. Guys, I did one of the first psych studies I've ever done in undergrad, because undergrad psych people have to create their own, studies. They have to do it. And one thing I did was doing performance, was the association between performance and mentors, so coaches. And obviously there was a significant amount of increase and decrease in performance based on, if we're talking weekly, there's a significant difference or I mean, comparison between performance that week and their relationship with their coach, right? So not even just your parents and understanding your upbringing and how certain skills, whether communication, whether it's how you look to how you behave, it's not even just that. It's also understanding concepts and ideas that they instill on us, right? So sports psychologists, you know, in order to increase your game, you're going to have to understand your relationship with the people that you're closest with. And that's not even just parents or coaches. It's your siblings. It's your friends. It's the people that you're closest with every fucking day, right? So we have to be courteous and understanding of the people around us and how that impacts us when we are doing what we do. Whether it's sports or if it's in the workplace. If it's at school, if it's working with other people, if you work with people such as kids and you work with, you know, even adults, say a guy like me working with a 65-year-old, I have to be aware of me and how these people affect me personally and how I can better help them, right? Understanding that intrinsic motivation and how that is going to help me build on this interpersonal connection, right? Sports psychology helps you navigate your sports career. So every sport has its own nooks and crannies, right? If I were to take, let's say, esports, and let's say I'm a pro gamer at Squadrons. Flying, having that feeling of being in space and moving around and guiding myself. Sure, understanding auxiliaries and all that stuff that has to do with like ships and all that stuff, all the technical stuff, sure. But there's a concept of feeling that's there, guys. Let's talk about like an actual sport of let's say football, right? It's a team-oriented sport, right? But there is a certain role that is a part of that team integration of feeling, right? Let's talk about wrestling. Being able to take shots and flow with that person, always keeping your hands on, baiting while retreating, right? Scoring points consistently, always understanding where the clock is, right? As it's winding down at the end of the period. That's a concept of feeling and awareness. That's what sports psychology helps us with. It's really understanding that concept of feeling. How this sport is connected with me emotionally, cognitively, but also in a spiritual way as well. And I think a lot of people sleep on that concept. How spiritually this sport is, you know, a part of our belief system, how this integrates with us. So that's also a really important concept of sports. Preparing your mind whenever you're getting ready to take on a large task, something that seems a little, it seems impossible. Say athletes going into the Olympics, they've been training for this shit all their life. Or sometimes they've been training for this since they were given this opportunity. But you conceptualize these big events to becoming a overwhelming task. So for us to prepare ourselves, we all have individual ways that really connect with us, that really vibe with us, that really help us complete this task in the end, that make us the winners rather than the losers. And when we do lose, how do we conceptualize that? And how do we take these lessons home with us? That's huge, guys. So sports psychology not only prepares us to complete these tasks, but these larger moments within our workplace, within school and so forth. It helps us prepare us for the mental blocks we have every day. Our demons, it's contagious, man, because whenever you're around people that, you know, complain and whine and really vocalize what they're feeling and how that really just penetrates our soul, it's contagious. You take that home with you. And I know we talk a lot about the force and everything, but that energy field is there, and we have to consider that, right? Enter the zone is the same concept as really preparing your mind. Preparing your mind is getting ready for the task at hand, mental readiness and so forth. But we also have, when you're in the zone, when it's just you and that task, and you zone out everything else, what does that look like? What is that relationship in that task? How do you compare yourself to what needs to be done? You're not going to think about everything around you, right? Because that's for people that are unprepared and don't really understand what you're doing. Sure, they might tune in more distractions, a lot of stimulus in their environment, and they might soak that in a lot more, but that's not really it. That's not what happens when you do something you love. When you play a sport, when you play video games, when you do work that you love to do, when you're with people that you love to talk to and to be with, nothing else matters except that one person, except that one thing, right? So when we talk about psychology within sports, it's really just the understanding of how we behave in those moments, those critical moments. Afterwards, after the task is completed, after whatever happens, then we can process what happens. Sometimes we're more likely to think negatively of those moments, unless, the best case scenario happens and everything is firing on all cylinders and everything's going right. But at the same time, we also forget about some of those parts of those moments, right? When we are in the zone, we block out everything and we are only focused on that one thing. When we're done and we review it like a week later, 2 weeks later, we forget a lot of that stuff until we're back into that moment and then we're reliving it. We talked about kinesthetic intelligence when we talked about learning styles. Being our body in reflection to what we do, right? Our body creates a lot of our memories, right? Through tactile support, visually, auditory, olfactory. There's a lot of that comes into play with what we remember in those moments of completing that task. So it's also very important to analyze yourself and feel that moment and be put in those situations as much as possible so that you practice going through those moments, right, where it matters the most to you. So that's also what sports psychology reviews on. Setbacks, we talked about losing. Losing is a huge way of life through trial and error, through the ways that we do things, through to what we didn't do right. Being set back is all part of trial and error. And if we always talk about behavioralism, behavioral theory within psychology, and that's usually where sports psychology stems from, is behavioralism. When we talk about those trial and errors, what went right, what went wrong, and we connect with ourselves cognitively and emotionally. And that's the best part about sports psychology. It's a very integrative approach towards understanding how each moment reflects with us in all capacities, which I love about sports psychology. And this is also one big topic in psychology: motivation and drive. Motivation and drive to get what you need done, but to have this feeling that nothing else can stop you, because this is the only thing that's on your mind. Motivation can be intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic within us, extrinsic factors around us that really influence our motivation and drive, right? So when we think about, all these athletes competing in the Olympics and doing something unbelievable, things that we could never think about doing, that's because their motivation and drive at that moment, their preparation, everything behind them is set to win that. And that's the only thing they have on their mind. When even in the most impossible situations, when you're down by 2, when you're down by however many points, you still have the drive to push back and to fight to the last second. In sports psychology, that is one of the greatest topics of research, is how we fight back, even with adversity. So consider that. So let's go back into history. Let's talk a little bit of stress and pressure. Dealing with stress and pressure. Yeah, that's also very important. When you're in the heat of the moment and you feel this demon inside you saying, you can't do this, this is it, give up. When you feel this high level of anxiousness, when you are starting to feel it, you're starting to sweat a lot more, you're starting to breathe a lot more heavier, you're taking a lot more energy out of what you do to do what you need to do. I'm telling you, in those high pressure situations, you use a lot of energy. So knowing how to manage that through breathing exercises, through mindfulness, self-care, all those things, they really actually encourage you to manage that stress in those moments, because it's like what you're doing is really mindfulness. It's reorganizing the narrative. In those moments that you're feeling stress and anxiety, is that what defines you as an athlete? Is that stress pushing you forward? Or is it the mindfulness and self-care of, I'm doing what I love, so I deserve this because I love it more than they do. I have a bigger heart than this athlete in the end. In the end, when it's close and the game is tied up and you need to fucking win this, who has the bigger heart? And usually that has to do with that mindfulness piece and managing stress and pressure. Paradox of success, that's kind of like what we talked about. So again, let's talk about social facilitation. We'll talk about triplets theory within social facilitation. He was the original piece in sports psychology, meaning he was the first person to write a paper about sports psychology. And I would consider him one of the original social psychologists of our time. Now, when he analyzed his data for social facilitation, it was really the scenario was that he was testing cyclers, right? People who professionally biked for a living, and what he was trying to see is how could they do that extra mile, and looking at that intrinsic motivational piece, what are the factors in which they are able to complete the task better than others can, right? Finish a race better than others. And he found that there was a relationship with cyclers and performance in comparison to being alone to competing against others. Cyclers did worse being alone. Like if you were like, for example, I run with my brother because I find myself pushing the pace a lot better when I'm with somebody compared to if I do it alone. If I go alone, I go slower, I get tired much easier. That stress, it kind of builds up. Sometimes we listen to music so we don't feel alone, right? We have this auditory stimulation to keep us going. And it's the same concept with the social facilitation theory, is that people around us that are doing the same thing will encourage us to do better. And as social beings, I think that this is beautiful because, starting off sports psychology, we realize that when we do something great, we're not doing it alone. And we always need to take note of that, ladies and gentlemen. We always need to take note of that. No matter who you are, no matter where you are, we can't do great things without people, without you. I can't build this community without you. I can't be a good counselor and a good theorist and a good researcher without other people with critical thinking and feedback to help me better myself. So as social beings, this I thought was a very impressive thing. And so that's kind of how the origin of sports psychology came, was with Triplett's social facilitation theory. So moving forward, we talked about the first American sports psychologist, and we talked a little bit about Coleman Griffith, who was he was an experimental psychologist, but he was then recategorized as a sports psychologist. And the reason why is because he took Triplett's theory and his paper on social facilitation, and he brought that over to America. So then he started creating his own research and everything related to anxiety, depression, social facilitation as well, obedience with coaches, understanding, this was a little bit more further on in sports psychology, but trauma and how trauma also affects us and what we do, right? And he was later on hired by the Chicago Cubs. The Chicago Cubs has not had a good history in Major League Baseball. I'm going to be honest, guys. I've looked at their record, and they only have three national championships. World championships. 2 in, like, the 1910s. Well, I'm sorry, the 1900s. And then the next one was in, like, early 2000. They thought that if hiring a sports psychologist would better help their chances of getting that championship win and having a long playoff win. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Unfortunately, that did not happen. But he continued, Griffith continued his working with the Chicago Cubs and utilizing that for his lab at Illinois University. So Griffith was kind of the first person to make his first sports psychology lab. And a lot of our framework, we talk about the father of sports psychology. Anytime we talk about the father of something, that's probably because that person, the father, has created a lot of baseline data so that future researchers can build on it, create more explicit evidence-based research, and so forth. Griffith was one of those people that created that framework. Like Freud did for psychoanalysis, Griffith did for sports psychology. So if you guys want to look at a little bit more into his work, what he did as a sports psychologist, as the original sports psychologist, you're more than welcome to check it out. This is just like a basic. APA is the American Psychological Association, which all areas of psychology stem from, whether counseling, sports psychology, trauma, anything you can think of stems from APA. So I thought this was a great article to kind of look at. And again, he did the best he could with working with what he had. And again, he had so much to work from because it wasn't but they obviously built on his work and so forth leading up to it. So now I want to kind of fast forward to today. When we talk about sports psychology, remember managing stress, pressure, motivation, identity, purpose, all these things. We want to think about where is sports psychology kind of leading us, right? And again, this is a watered down version of sports psychology. If you get more into it, you go into individualistics within psychology, research and all that, which has to do with what they did and how they built up to it. One big thing, as I mentioned, is trauma, how trauma affects or somebody's general past affects what they do. PTSD within sports. PTSD doesn't always have to do with it doesn't always have to do with war. sports psychology. Sports psychology can encompasses PTSD, because if you're in a moment, again, we talk about losing and setbacks. When you're in that moment and you really kind of like eat yourself up from those moments, you can create trauma from those moments. And so a lot of psychologists are working on that, talking about how trauma can lead to good situations, bad situations within sports psychology or any other area in life. So I thought it would be good to kind of talk about where the future of sports psychology is heading and get a little bit more into video games. So when we talk about video games, we have to talk about gamification. Gamification is the concept of making boring things into something that's worth doing, right? Gamification has to do with the influence of writing papers, completing files, desk work, going to do like very difficult tasks and creating a game out of it. This all kind of stems from, believe it or not, this came from stamps. This came from wartime stamps. And having people participate in, you know, getting weapons ready, you know, doing things at home and receiving food stamps and bonds and stuff for their incentives. So, but as psychology carried on, everybody's incentives to completing a task right and completing it within a good period of time, where you're not just rushing things, but doing it for the fact of, you know, I'm doing it because I really actually enjoy doing it, is the understanding that you want incentive that works for you. Everybody has reinforcement that works differently for them. I like eating candy at the end of the day as like a dessert. Miss Boy can probably yell at me for that, but I do like my candy, and that's my reward for, you know, doing the stuff that we do here, or doing the stuff that we do, you know, getting off the workday, being with family sometimes, having incentive within being with those family members that, you know, don't really click with you the most. Having those incentives really help. And again, stemming from behavioralism. So gamification is this new ideology of how what we do in everyday life can be fun, and we have to find ways in which it is fun. For sports psychology, if you are, say we talked about Simone Biles a little bit, and you're carrying all this pressure of media and propaganda, you're gonna lose that incentive of just a little bit to be a good athlete, because you have a lot of haters out there. You have a lot of people that are influencing your decision making and your emotional well-being. So gamification is kind of like this system in which we can utilize sports psychology anywhere we go, because we reorganize the narrative of what we do, and we find a way in which the narrative works in our favor, so that whatever we do, we're doing it in our own terms, right? And that sometimes can be really hard when you're working for somebody, when you're working for a large corporation, the federal government. It can be very difficult. Very, very difficult. So having some incentive when you're doing it, aside from money, can also be very rewarding. And that's kind of like how gaming has evolved, not only sports psychology, but psychology in general. How we enjoy things in life and how we find motivation to do things. It's really based on finding incentive and reinforcement that really ties us emotionally to what we do. Build a connection, that relationship with what we do, right? So, esports. Why is esports so popular? Yes, it gets a lot of fan base. Yes, it's been around for a long time. Yes. It's been there to the point where we have so much information on it. And if anything, esports is actually the new way of sports psychology to research, because you can track information so well over time compared to athletes who go home then come to work. When you play video games for 12 hours out of the day, for pro players who play for a long period of time, right, they can be tracked well for data. And that is a reflection to understanding this concept of how performance is a trajectory path, rather than, okay, this happened at this moment, you saw practice, we talked to them on this day, next event, practice, interview, event, and so forth, rather than you see them practicing every day. And we talk about social media, talk about streamers. A lot of pro players are streamers, so you get to see them every day playing that game, which is why sports psychology is now starting to formulate towards esports. Also, we just ended the Olympics. However, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, was considering video games as a part of, and esports in general, as a part of the games. Why is that, guys? Well, when we talk about the Olympics, we did talk about how news stations are the ones who cast these events, right? When I was in Israel, I had a lot of trouble finding a lot of these events. I couldn't just go to a website and look up wrestling. I couldn't do that because they didn't host it. Those are private entities within casting events, right? We know that, what is it? Is it Peacock? Peacock now does, I think they had Snoop Dogg casting the Olympics, and they now, who was it? I'm sorry, it's either, there's some streaming platform that has Thursday Night Football. And so now, because of the viewership and the amount of people that subscribe to these streaming services, they're starting to pour in and starting to watch these events. So going back to my original topic, the International Olympic Committee saw that a lot of propaganda, a lot of advertisement and sponsorship comes through video games because of these social media platforms. So it's building this future for the Olympics. That's what they want. We saw skateboarding and surfing being added to on the docket within sporting events. They actually really did consider adding esports like Rocket League or Dota 2. They actually did consider that, but it's just too soon. Now, fast forward 4 years from now when we have, well, actually, let's fast forward to the next Summer Olympics. They have incorporated esports. Why? Because obviously viewership, but because people fucking love it. People watch this. They see talent at all ages, mostly at a young age. And we see it on such a high level. We see people over the age of 35 watching these athletes and not idolizing them per se, but seeing them as a role model in a game that they love. So when we think about the future for sports psychology, yes, we have our basic stuff. We have basketball, we have swimming, we have judo, and then we have our new stuff like skateboarding. The Japanese won gold medal in skateboarding. They realized, oh shit, this is insane. A new event, one of the first champions is Japanese within our hometown. But who's to say that anybody can win in esports? It's not that easy. But it's intriguing because you can have multiple events, multiple games playing on that level of Olympic, like a high level Olympic type performance. Sports psychologists are thinking, well, this is interesting because now we can analyze all the things that we have been analyzing on a greater scale. When we want to measure pressure, stress, anxiety, depression, and all those setbacks, we're talking about sports psychology, and we're talking about sports psychology. When we talk about the future for sports psychology, it is esports. Now, there's other facets to it. We talk about how technology also evolves an athlete within any sport, right? But this is just the start of how sports psychology is evolving through the course of time. It's not just about social facilitation anymore. It's about how media, propaganda, how sponsorships, how a large viewing can come back and reassemble and see something so big within something new. And that's like the story of humanity, is trying something new, building on innovation. We were talking about how wrestling also is another situation which sports psychology also is invested in, because wrestling is an individualized sport. You really want to know what goes on in that mind in a 6-minute bout. In a 6-minute bout in freestyle wrestling against one of the biggest dudes in the world. Holy shit, man. It's not easy, especially if you're a returning champion coming back to defend your title. Woo! You gotta wonder what's going on in his head. We had I'll actually bring up a topic in wrestling. Kyle Snyder wrestled a Russian named Sadalov, who is one of the best wrestlers of our time. But Kyle Snyder, as the young bull as he was, he's about 26 now. When he was 21 or 22, he won an Olympic medal beating this guy. He beat this guy. And ever since, they've had the greatest rivalry in Olympic history, in Olympic wrestling history. But imagine that moment when you make it to the finals and you know you're going against that one person that has stopped you before and can restrain you from winning something that it's a tournament that you compete in every 4 years. It doesn't happen often. So when you build up to that moment psychologically, you are dealing with a shit ton of stress. That's why the Olympics is probably one of the most stressful events in the history of history. Is because there's a lot of build up to those moments. Right? Let's talk about individual lives. When you're about to get your dream job and you're getting into that interview, you've already made it past the application stage, and you're in that interview and you've built up all of this stress and anxiety and pressure since you were in elementary school, and you're there and you're talking with those people at Google, Microsoft. Holy fuck, man. That's sports psychology. So I'm going to leave you with that, because honestly, guys, sports psychology is made to understand performance. It's made to understand why we do great things in life and why people fall so hard. Sports psychology is not always about sport. It's about what we do every fucking day and how we build up to our dreams. We talk about the American dream. That's also another example of sports psychology. How we build up over time to achieving that dream and the process into getting there, right? sports psychology is really just more specific to sports, but a lot of the ideology of sports psychology is used all throughout our lives, no matter what we do. So again, I'm gonna leave you guys with that today. Here's a little bit of an article from the Washington Post about the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, talking about gaming and adding gaming. They said they didn't want violent games, but eventually they will have violent games in the Olympics because it builds a new attraction, new population. Got to make your money somehow. And what better way to build your money than through the number one most popular entertainment field in general. Video games will stampede over movies, TV shows any day. Why? Because there's content every fucking day on Twitch, on YouTube, on Facebook gaming, TikTok, Instagram, wherever. On these social media platforms, there's new content out there every day from multiple and different types of people. Streamers, people alike. Alright? So, that's what we're ending with today. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me on this topic of psychology, discussing sports psychology, and even talking about how sports psychology relates to us on everyday life, and how this area, the field of sports psychology, will lead us to being more of a digital world. One day. When people are ready. But I digress.